A powerful man sat alone in a quiet café, sipping his usual black coffee, believing the world outside that window had nothing left to surprise him. Then two soaked little girls burst through the door and ran straight to his table. One leaned close and whispered words that froze the blood in his veins. "Please, that man isn't our dad." In that single moment, a calm afternoon turned into a choice between walking away or standing up against something darker than anything even a Mafia boss expected to face that day. If you enjoy powerful stories about family, justice, and the unexpected kindness that can change a life, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Now let me tell you how it all began. The rain that afternoon came down hard and sideways, the kind of cold November rain that made the whole city look tired. It pressed against the cafe windows in streaks of gray water, blurring the busy street outside until everything looked distant and unreal. Inside the cafe, things were warm and quiet. The smell of fresh bread and strong espresso floated through the room. Cups clinked gently against saucers. Soft conversations filled the air. It was the kind of place where people came to hide from the weather and forget their worries for an hour. And in the booth near the far window sat Robert Stoka. Everyone in the cafe knew that booth belonged to him. Nobody had ever said it out loud. No sign hung above the table. But somehow the staff and the regular customers all understood the rule. When Robert Stoka arrived, that booth stayed empty. Robert wasn't the loud kind of powerful man. He didn't walk around with bodyguards. He didn't shout. He didn't try to look important. But the moment he entered a room, people felt something change. He was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, dressed in a dark jacket and an open black shirt. Tattoos crept up his neck and across his hands like old memories that never quite faded. His eyes were cold and calm, the eyes of a man who had spent years making hard decisions in a world where mercy was often seen as weakness. But even men like Robert Stoka had habits. And one habit he never missed was his daily coffee in that booth by the window. 40 quiet minutes. No phone calls. No meetings. Just coffee and rain against the glass. For a man who ran one of the most feared criminal organizations in the city, those 40 minutes were the closest thing he had to peace. The red-haired waitress named Petra approached his table and placed a small cup in front of him. "Your coffee, Mr. Stoka." "Black." "No sugar." "Always the same." Robert nodded once in thanks. Petra had worked there long enough to understand something about him. Despite the rumors, despite the stories people whispered about the powerful crime boss who controlled half the city's underground world, he was never rude to the staff. Once, months ago, she had dropped an entire tray of cups right in front of him. She expected yelling. Instead, Robert had quietly helped her pick up every broken piece. Then he left a tip large enough to cover the damage. People were complicated like that. Robert lifted the cup slowly and took a sip, staring through the rain-streaked window. Across the cafe, the door opened. A tall man stepped inside wearing a gray coat and a wide hat. Water dripped from the edge of his sleeve as he shook off the rain. Robert noticed him the same way he noticed everything. Quietly. Filed away in the back of his mind. The man stood near the entrance, scanning the room with calm, careful eyes. Not nervous. Not lost. Looking. Robert took another sip of coffee. He had seen that kind of searching look many times before. It was the look of a hunter. And someone in this cafe was the target. But Robert returned his gaze to the window. It wasn't his business. Or at least, that's what he believed for about 5 more seconds. Because suddenly the door burst open again. 2 small figures ran inside. They were girls. Identical. Both about 9 years old, both soaked from head to toe, their braided hair half undone from running through the storm. They didn't hesitate. They didn't even look around. They ran straight across the cafe floor and slid into Robert Stoka's booth like frightened birds diving for shelter. One girl grabbed his arm with shaking hands. The other leaned close to his ear. Her voice was barely louder than a breath. "Please, don't let him take us." Robert slowly lowered his coffee cup onto the saucer. For the first time that afternoon, he turned his head. The girl on his left wore a yellow rain jacket. Her cheeks were pale, her breathing fast from running. The girl on his right wore a burgundy jacket and a dark scarf. Her fingers gripped Robert's forearm like she had decided this stranger was the only safe place left in the world. Robert followed her frightened gaze. Across the café, the man in the gray coat had stopped searching. His eyes had found the booth, and they were locked directly on the twins. For a moment, the entire café seemed to go silent. Robert studied the man carefully. Then he looked down at the trembling hand wrapped around his arm. And finally he spoke in a calm, quiet voice meant only for the two girls. "Stay close," he said. Then his eyes returned to the man walking slowly toward the booth. "And don't move unless I tell you to." Because something told Robert Stoka that the storm outside the café had just followed those two little girls inside. And it wasn't finished yet. The man in the gray coat began walking toward the booth. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just calm, steady steps, the kind that belonged to someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Robert didn't move. His right hand rested under the table, fingers lightly touching the grip of the pistol tucked inside his jacket. He didn't draw it. Not yet. But the motion was instinctive, quiet, controlled. The girl in the yellow jacket leaned closer, her small voice trembling against his ear. "Please, he'll take us back." Robert said nothing. Across the café, the man kept coming. Customers began noticing the tension before they understood it. Conversations faded. A few people looked down at their phones or coffee cups, pretending not to watch. The man stopped at the edge of the table. Up close he looked even colder than Robert expected. Tall, sharp features, dark hair slicked back, the gray coat expensive and perfectly fitted. He glanced at the girls first. Not like a worried parent. More like a man confirming that something valuable was exactly where he left it. Then he looked at Robert and gave a polite smile. "I apologize," the man said smoothly. "My daughters have a habit of running off when they're upset." Neither girl moved. The one in burgundy tightened her grip around Robert's arm. Robert studied the man for a moment. Then he calmly picked up his coffee and took another sip. "They don't seem eager to leave," he said. The man's smile held, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Children rarely know what's good for them," he replied. Robert leaned back slightly in the booth. His voice remained quiet. "Maybe," the girl in yellow whispered quickly. "He's lying." Robert turned his head just enough to look at her. Her eyes were wide, dark, and exhausted in a way that didn't belong on a 9-year-old face. He spoke softly. "What's your name?" "Lily." "And your sister?" "Lola." Robert nodded once. Then he looked back at the man. "Strange," Robert said casually. "You never said their names." For the first time, the man's smile thinned. He studied Robert more carefully now. "Sir," the man said, voice still controlled, "this is a family matter. I'd prefer not to create a scene." The café had gone almost completely silent. Even the espresso machine behind the counter had stopped. Robert placed his coffee cup down. Then he looked at Lily. "Do you know this man?" Lily didn't hesitate. "No." Her voice was small, but certain. Lola nodded beside her. Robert felt the tension shift instantly. Across from him, the man in gray coat exhaled slowly, the polite mask slipping just a little. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Robert tilted his head slightly. "I make a lot of those." The man leaned closer to the table. "You don't understand what you're stepping into." Robert met his gaze without blinking. I understand enough. A long second passed between them. The rain tapped steadily against the windows. Then the man straightened his coat. Well, he said calmly, this doesn't need to get unpleasant. Robert noticed the small movement of the man's eyes toward the cafe entrance. Just a flick. Robert followed the glance. Through the glass door, two large men stood outside under the rain, watching. Waiting. Robert slowly leaned back in his seat. Friends of yours? He asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he folded his hands on the table and looked directly at Robert. You're a smart man, he said. Walk away from this. Lily's fingers tightened around Robert's sleeve. Robert looked down briefly at the small hand gripping his arm. He had built an empire by knowing when to stay out of trouble. Most people who crossed paths with men like Patrick never saw morning again. He could finish his coffee. Stand up. Leave. And by tonight, this entire situation would be someone else's problem. But then he heard Lily's voice again, quiet and desperate. We ran from him. Robert glanced at her. How long? All day. Lola spoke next, barely above a whisper. He took our mom. That sentence landed in the booth like a stone dropped into deep water. Robert looked at her carefully. What do you mean? Lily swallowed. Our dad owed him money, she said. The man across the table shifted slightly. Robert noticed. Go on, Robert said. Lily looked at the table for a moment before continuing. Dad disappeared 4 months ago. Then he started coming to our apartment. She nodded toward the man. At first he just asked for the money. Her voice grew flatter. Then he stopped asking. Robert's eyes hardened slightly. What happened to your mother? Lola answered this time. He took her. Silence filled the booth. Across the table, the man's patience finally began to crack. That's enough, he said sharply. Robert didn't look at him. Keep talking, Robert said gently. Lily's voice trembled. He said we're worth more than the debt. Robert felt something cold move through his chest. What does that mean? Lily lifted her eyes. We heard him on the phone. Her next words came slowly, carefully, like she had memorized them. He said twins sell for more. The air in the cafe seemed to freeze. Robert slowly turned his head toward the man across the table. The smile was gone now. Completely gone. Only calculation remained. And for the first time that afternoon, Robert Stoka realized something very important. The storm these girls had brought into his quiet cafe was much bigger than one desperate man chasing 2 children. Because people who sold children didn't work alone. And the man sitting across from him was just the beginning. For a moment, nobody spoke. Robert kept his eyes on the man across the table, but his thoughts were moving somewhere deeper now, somewhere colder. People in his world did terrible things. He knew that better than anyone. Money, power, territory. Those things drove men into darkness every day. But there was a line. And the girl sitting beside him had just told him that the man across the table had crossed it. The man leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. You shouldn't listen to frightened children, he said calmly. Robert didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned his head and looked at Lily. Her small hands were folded tightly together on the table. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just watching him. The way a child watches an adult when their whole future might depend on what that adult decides next. Lola was different. She wasn't looking at Robert. She was watching the cafe door. Careful. Alert. Like she had learned the hard way that danger often came from the places people stopped paying attention to. Robert turned back toward the man. What's your name? He asked. The man hesitated for half a second. Patrick. Robert nodded slowly. Patrick, he repeated, like he was filing the name somewhere useful. Patrick exhaled and leaned back slightly in his chair. "Now that we've introduced ourselves," Patrick said, "let's end this misunderstanding." He looked at the twins. "Girls," he said, his tone suddenly softer, almost fatherly, "you've caused enough trouble today." Lily didn't move. Neither did Lola. Patrick's eyes drifted back to Robert. "You seem like a practical man," he said quietly. "I respect that." Robert raised one eyebrow. "Do you?" Patrick nodded. "I know who you are." That didn't surprise Robert. Men in Patrick's business usually did their homework. Patrick continued. "You're successful. Powerful. You've built something impressive." His voice remained polite, but there was a hard edge underneath. "You didn't get there by involving yourself in problems that don't belong to you." Robert rested his elbow on the table. "That depends on the problem." Patrick gave a thin smile. "This one," he said, "belongs to me." Outside, the rain continued falling against the glass. Robert glanced briefly toward the door. The two men still stood there. Big. Professional. Waiting. He could feel Lily's small hand tightening again around his sleeve. Robert sighed quietly and picked up his coffee cup. He took one last slow sip. Then he set the cup down. "Patrick," he said calmly, "let me ask you something." Patrick tilted his head. "Sure." Robert leaned forward slightly. "If those girls are your daughters." Patrick's eyes narrowed just a little. "Which one is older?" Patrick didn't answer immediately. Just a fraction too long. Robert saw it. That tiny delay. The tiny fracture in the performance. Lily watched Patrick closely now. Lola too. Patrick finally spoke. "They're twins." Robert nodded slowly. "Right." He leaned back again, studying Patrick like a man looking at a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Then Robert turned his head slightly toward Lily. "How old did you say you were?" 9, Lily answered. "And 3/4, Lola added quietly. Robert almost smiled. Then he looked back at Patrick. "Funny thing about parents," Robert said. Patrick's jaw tightened. "What's that?" "They usually know their kids pretty well." Patrick's voice cooled. "You're testing my patience." Robert shrugged lightly. "You walked to my table." Across the café, someone quietly slid their chair back and left. The tension in the room had become impossible to ignore. Patrick noticed it too. He glanced once toward the door. Then back to Robert. "You're making a mistake," he said again, softer this time. Robert's eyes didn't move. "You keep saying that." Patrick leaned closer. "You have no idea what kind of people I work with." Robert studied him. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think I do." The words hung between them. Patrick sat back again, thinking. For the first time, he looked at Robert not as a stranger, but as a real obstacle. The kind of obstacle that changed plans. Lily suddenly spoke again. "We heard the phone call." Patrick's head snapped slightly toward her. Her voice trembled, but she kept going. "You said Thursday." Robert's eyes sharpened. Patrick said nothing. Lily swallowed. "You said the cargo was ready." Robert slowly turned his head back toward Patrick. The café felt smaller now. Quieter. Lily continued. "You said 2 units." Her voice broke slightly. "Matching." Patrick's expression hardened completely. And in that moment, Robert understood something very clearly. Patrick wasn't just a desperate debt collector. He was part of something bigger. Organized. Structured. The kind of business that treated human lives like numbers on a ledger. Robert leaned back in his seat. Under the table, his hand rested calmly against the pistol again. Patrick noticed the shift in Robert's posture. His voice dropped. "This is the last time I'm going to say it." Robert waited. Patrick leaned forward. "Stand up." Lily's fingers dug into Robert's sleeve. Patrick continued. "Walk out of this cafe." His eyes flicked toward the girls. "And forget you ever saw them." Robert was quiet for a long moment. The rain tapped softly on the windows. Then he spoke. "What if I don't?" Patrick smiled slowly. But there was nothing friendly about it now. "Then," Patrick said quietly, "this cafe becomes a very dangerous place." Robert turned his head slightly toward the door again. The two men outside were already starting to move. And Robert realized something important. The quiet afternoon was officially over. Because the moment those men stepped through that door, everything in the cafe was about to change. The cafe door opened. Cold rain and gray light slipped inside with the two men who stepped through it. They were big men, the kind whose size didn't come from comfort or good meals, but from hard work and harder habits. Their coats were dark and wet at the shoulders, and they moved with quiet purpose. Nobody in the cafe spoke. A couple near the window stood up quickly and left without finishing their drinks. The old man by the counter lowered his newspaper but didn't turn the page. Robert stayed seated. Lily's hand was still wrapped around his sleeve. Lola's eyes followed the two men carefully as they spread out inside the cafe, one near the door, the other moving along the wall. Patrick watched Robert the way a man watches a clock tick toward a deadline. "You see," Patrick said calmly, "I tried to be polite." Robert rested his arm on the table, fingers relaxed. "You're still being polite," he said. Patrick smiled thinly. "Am I?" The man near the wall stopped about 10 feet away from the booth. The other remained close to the door, blocking the exit without making it obvious. Lily leaned slightly closer to Robert. Her voice was almost silent. "They're the ones who watch our apartment." Robert didn't turn his head. But he heard her. Patrick clasped his hands together on the table again. "Let's stop pretending this conversation has options," he said quietly. Robert looked at him. Patrick's voice remained calm, but something colder had settled into it. "You're a smart man, Robert. Rich men don't stay rich by making emotional decisions." Robert tilted his head slightly. "Who said I'm emotional?" Patrick glanced at the girls. "That right there," he said. Lily stiffened. Patrick continued. "You think you're protecting them. I understand the instinct." His eyes returned to Robert. "But instincts don't change reality." Robert said nothing. Patrick leaned closer. "Their father borrowed money he couldn't repay. That's not my fault." Lily's voice came suddenly, sharp with anger. "You made him borrow it." Patrick looked at her slowly. "No," he said calmly. "Your father made choices." Lily's hands clenched. "You kept coming to our house." Patrick shrugged lightly. "That's what happens when debts aren't paid." Lola spoke for the first time since the men entered the cafe. "You locked Mom in the bedroom." Patrick's eyes flicked toward her. Robert noticed that. "Did you?" Robert asked quietly. Patrick sighed. "You're listening to children again." Robert's voice stayed level. "That's usually where the truth is." The man near the wall shifted his weight slightly. His eyes never left Robert. Patrick tapped a finger on the table. "Let me explain something to you," he said. Robert waited. Patrick leaned forward just enough that only Robert and the girls could hear. "Those two girls are not the story." Robert's expression didn't change. Patrick continued softly. "They're just part of a much bigger business." The words hung heavy in the air. Robert felt Lily's grip tighten again. Patrick leaned back, studying Robert carefully. "You're wealthy. Powerful. You understand markets." Robert didn't answer. Patrick spoke like a man explaining a simple math problem. There's demand. There's supply. And there's money. Lily's voice shook. "You said we're cargo." Patrick didn't look at her. Robert did. Her eyes were glassy now, but she refused to cry. Robert looked back at Patrick. "You ever hear of lines?" Robert asked. Patrick frowned slightly. "What?" Robert's voice was calm, but something deeper had entered it. "Lines," he repeated. "Things a man just doesn't do." Patrick gave a quiet chuckle. "That's a luxury belief." Robert leaned back in the booth. "I disagree." The man near the wall took a step closer. Patrick noticed but didn't stop him. "Robert," Patrick said patiently, "this city runs on money." Robert nodded. "True. Poor people borrow. Rich people collect." Robert's eyes drifted briefly toward Lily and Lola, two soaked girls who had run through a storm because they had nowhere else to go. Patrick kept talking. "You built your empire by understanding that." Robert looked back at him. "No," he said quietly. Patrick raised an eyebrow. "I built it," Robert continued, "by knowing which doors not to open." Patrick's patience finally began to thin. "You're romanticizing something ugly." Robert shrugged slightly. "Maybe." Patrick gestured toward the girls. "But you're about to die for it." The man near the wall took another step closer. The second man by the door straightened. Robert didn't move. Instead, he spoke quietly to the twins without looking at them. "Stay behind me." Lily nodded quickly. Lola slid slightly closer to the inside of the booth. Patrick sighed. "You're forcing my hand." Robert's eyes returned to him. "You already played it." Patrick stood up slowly from the table. "Last chance." Robert remained seated. Patrick buttoned his coat. "You're about to make a lot of people angry." Robert looked up at him. "You should see the list of people already angry at me." Patrick studied him for a long second. Then he gave a small nod toward the man near the wall. That was the signal. The man stepped forward. Lily inhaled sharply. But before the man could reach the booth, Robert stood up. The movement was fast. Not dramatic. Just sudden and precise. The chair scraped quietly against the floor. The man hesitated for a split second. That was all Robert needed. Because in that brief moment, everyone in the café realized something Patrick had misunderstood. Robert Stoka wasn't standing up because he was afraid. He was standing up because he had finally made his decision. And Patrick was about to learn exactly what that decision meant. The man reaching for the booth never finished his step. Robert moved first. Not fast in a wild way. Not angry. Just precise, like a man who had done this 1,000 times and never wasted emotion. His hand caught the man's wrist before it could grab the table. In the same movement, Robert pulled him forward and turned his body slightly. The man's momentum carried him straight into the hard wooden divider of the booth. The crack of bone against wood echoed across the café. Gasps rose from the few customers still inside. The man collapsed instantly, sliding to the floor with a dull thud. The second man near the door reacted a split second later. He rushed forward, anger replacing the calm professionalism he'd carried when he walked in. But Robert was already moving. The man lunged. Robert stepped aside and caught his arm mid-swing. With a short twist and a sharp push, the man's balance broke. His shoulder hit a nearby table, sending cups crashing to the floor. Coffee splashed across the tiles. The man tried to stand again, but Robert's hand pressed firmly against the back of his neck, pushing him down. "Stay down," Robert said quietly. And somehow, the quietness of his voice made it sound like the smartest advice that man would ever receive. The cafe fell completely silent. Robert straightened his jacket slowly. Patrick hadn't moved. He stood near the table exactly where he had been, watching the scene with cold eyes. Not shocked, not afraid, just calculating. The two men on the floor groaned quietly but didn't attempt to stand again. Patrick exhaled slowly. "Well," he said almost thoughtfully. "That escalated." Robert looked at him. "You sent them?" Patrick nodded once. "Yes." Robert leaned one hand on the table. "You're done here." Patrick studied him carefully. "You think so?" Robert's voice stayed calm. "I know so." Patrick's eyes drifted briefly toward the girls sitting behind Robert. Lily held Lola's hand tightly now, both of them staring at the floor where the two men lay groaning. Patrick's voice softened again, almost sympathetic. "You know what the problem is with men like you, Robert?" Robert didn't answer. Patrick continued anyway. "You believe there are rules." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. Patrick spread his hands. "There aren't." The rain outside seemed louder now. Patrick stepped slowly around the table, careful not to slip on the spilled coffee. "You stopped two men," he said. "Congratulations." He stopped about 6 feet from Robert. "But this business doesn't end with two men." Robert watched him carefully. Patrick's tone remained steady. "Do you know how many people are involved in this network?" Robert didn't respond. Patrick smiled faintly. "You don't." He gestured lightly toward Lily and Lola. Those girls were scheduled to move Thursday. Lily's breathing quickened. Robert heard it. Patrick continued calmly. 2 days. He tapped his finger against the table. "The paperwork is already done." Robert's jaw tightened slightly. Patrick leaned closer. "Do you know how many shipments move through the port every week?" Robert's voice was low. "Enough." Patrick nodded. "Exactly." His eyes were sharp now. "You can't stop something that big." Robert looked at him for a long moment. "Watch me." Patrick laughed quietly. Not loudly. Just a tired laugh. "You're thinking small." Robert tilted his head slightly. "How so?" Patrick gestured around the cafe. "This city." Then he pointed toward the rain-covered street outside. "This country." His voice dropped. "We operate across 4 borders." The words settled into the room like cold fog. Patrick continued. "Shipping companies. Documents. Safe houses." Robert's expression didn't change, but something inside him hardened. Patrick spoke again. "You take down one warehouse, another opens." His eyes flicked briefly toward the girls. "You save 2 children." He shrugged. 10 more replace them." Lily's voice suddenly cut through the silence. "We're not cargo." Patrick turned his head slowly toward her. His expression was blank. Robert spoke before Patrick could answer. "They're right." Patrick's attention returned to him. "You really believe you can shut this down?" Robert thought for a moment. Then he answered honestly. "No." Patrick looked almost surprised. Robert continued calmly. "But I can shut you down." Patrick stared at him. The rain tapped steadily against the windows. Patrick's smile slowly returned, but it was colder than before. "You think I'm the boss?" Robert didn't answer. Patrick leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I'm a coordinator." Robert's eyes sharpened. Patrick nodded slightly. "You take me out." He tilted his head. "Someone else fills the chair tomorrow." Robert studied him carefully. Patrick stepped back toward the door. "You've already made tonight very inconvenient." He glanced at the 2 men still on the floor. "They'll recover." Robert didn't move. Patrick reached the door and placed his hand on the handle. But before opening it, he looked back one last time. 2 days, he said quietly. His eyes rested on the twins. Thursday. Then he looked at Robert again. If you want to play hero, you better move fast. Patrick opened the door. Cold rain and gray light rushed in again. He stepped outside and disappeared into the storm. The café stayed silent for a long moment. Robert stood still, watching the door. Behind him, Lily's voice trembled. Is he telling the truth? Robert didn't turn around immediately. He stared through the rain-streaked glass at the empty street. 2 days. Finally, he looked back at the twins. Yes, he said quietly. Lily swallowed. What do we do now? Robert walked back to the booth and sat down slowly. He picked up his coffee cup. It was cold now. He stared into it for a moment before answering. First, he said calmly, you're going to eat something. Lily blinked. What? Robert set the cup down. You've been running all day. Lola looked confused. You're not scared. Robert leaned back in the booth. Of Patrick? He shook his head slightly. No. Lily studied him carefully. Why not? Robert looked toward the rain again. Because in his mind, the situation was already changing. He had heard enough. Seen enough. Under the table, his hand reached quietly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he dialed a number. When the call connected, Robert spoke only 4 calm words. I need a location. And somewhere across the city, in a warehouse near dark water and silent cranes, a woman sat alone in a locked room, waiting, without knowing that the man she had never met had just started a war to bring her home. Robert ended the call and placed the phone back into his jacket pocket. For a moment he just sat there, looking at the table like a man studying the quiet before a storm. Across from him, Lily and Lola watched carefully. Children notice things adults miss. And what they noticed now was that the calm in Robert's face hadn't changed. If anything, it had grown deeper, colder, like the surface of a lake right before ice forms. Lily spoke first. Did they answer? Robert nodded once. They always do. Lola glanced toward the cafe door, still half expecting Patrick to walk back in. He's going to come back, she said quietly. Robert looked at her. Yes. Her shoulders stiffened. With more men? Yes. Lily leaned forward slightly. Then why are we still sitting here? Robert studied her face for a moment. She was 9 years old, but the way she asked that question carried the weight of someone who had been forced to grow up a little too quickly. Because running blindly doesn't help anyone, Robert said calmly. Lily frowned. But Mom. I know. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't have to. Lily swallowed the rest of her sentence. Robert leaned back in the booth. The waitress Petra was standing behind the counter again, pretending to wipe the same cup over and over while quietly watching the situation unfold. Robert raised a hand slightly. She walked over. Her voice was careful. Yes, Mr. Stoka? Robert nodded toward the twins. Bring them something hot. Pasta, soup, whatever's ready. Petra glanced at the girls. They were soaked, pale, and exhausted. She nodded gently. Right away. She turned and disappeared toward the kitchen. Lily looked confused. You're serious about the food? Robert looked at her. You can't fight a storm on an empty stomach. Lola tilted her head slightly. You're going to fight him? Robert's expression didn't change. I'm going to stop him. Lily leaned forward again. He said there are more people. A whole network. Robert nodded slowly. Yes. Lily's voice dropped. Then how can you stop something like that? Robert thought for a moment. Then he said something simple. By starting somewhere. The girls fell quiet. Outside, the rain had softened slightly, turning into a steady mist that blurred the streetlights and passing cars. Petra returned with 2 plates and set them gently in front of the twins. "Careful," she said softly. "It's hot." The smell of warm pasta and bread filled the small booth. For a second the girls just stared at the food. Then Lily picked up her fork. Lola followed. They ate quickly at first, the kind of focused eating that comes from real hunger. Robert watched them silently. Something in his chest tightened a little. It had been a long time since he'd seen children that close. A long time since he'd allowed himself to notice small things like tired eyes or shaking hands. Lily slowed down after a few bites. She looked up. "You said someone would find the location." Robert nodded. "Yes. How long will that take?" "Not long." Lola wiped her hands with a napkin. "Who did you call?" Robert looked at her for a moment. "A man who owes me." Lily tilted her head. "For what?" Robert took a slow breath. "For something I once helped him survive." He didn't say more. But the tone in his voice made it clear that the story behind that sentence wasn't simple. The girls didn't push further. After a moment Lily asked another question. "Why are you helping us?" Robert's eyes moved back to the window. The rain slid down the glass in thin, crooked lines. For a while he didn't answer. Then he said quietly, "Because someone should." Lily studied him carefully. "That's not the real reason." Robert looked back at her. Her eyes were steady. Children see through things faster than adults. He gave a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You're stubborn." "My mom says that too." Robert nodded slightly. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter. "I knew someone once." Lily waited. Robert continued slowly. "She was younger than you." Lola's fork stopped moving. Robert's gaze stayed on the rain. "She needed help." The girls listened carefully now. "I got there too late." Silence settled in the booth. Robert didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Some pain speaks for itself. After a moment Lola reached across the table and pushed the basket of bread toward him. "You should eat too," she said softly. Robert looked down at the bread. For a second he almost refused out of habit. Then he took a piece. "Thanks." Lily finished the last bite of her food and wiped her mouth. "So what happens now?" Robert checked his watch. "Now we wait." Lola frowned slightly. "For what?" Robert looked toward the door. "For information." Almost as if the word had summoned it, his phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He pulled it out. One message. One location. Robert read it once. Then again. Lily watched his face closely. "What is it?" Robert locked the phone and slipped it back into his jacket. "The place where your mother is being held." Both girls froze. Lola's voice was barely a whisper. "You found her?" Robert stood up slowly from the booth. "Yes." Lily jumped to her feet. "Then we need to go." Robert gently raised a hand. "Not yet." Lily stared at him. "But..." Robert's voice stayed calm. "That building will have guards. Cameras. Locked doors." He looked down at them. "If we rush in now, we don't save your mom." The girls fell silent. Robert continued. "We do this right." Lily swallowed. "How?" Robert looked out through the rain again. Far away in the harbor district, dark water moved between rusted docks and silent warehouses. The place Patrick had mentioned. The place where people like him hid the things they didn't want the world to see. Robert's eyes hardened slightly. "Tonight," he said quietly. Lola's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "You're really going there?" Robert picked up his jacket. "Yes." Lily's voice trembled again. "Are we coming?" Robert looked at both girls for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No." Lily's face fell. "But you're staying somewhere safe." Lola spoke softly. "Safe, like where?" Robert walked toward the door and stopped. Then he turned back toward them. "There's someone I trust." The girls exchanged a glance. Lily asked the question both of them were thinking. "And what about you?" Robert opened the cafe door. Cold air and soft rain drifted inside. He looked back at them once more. "I'm going to bring your mother home." And somewhere in the dark harbor district, a single light flickered inside a silent warehouse. The place where everything was about to begin. The rain followed Robert through the streets like a quiet witness. By the time the car rolled into the harbor district, the city had fallen into that strange late-night silence when even busy places feel abandoned. Orange cranes stood motionless against the dark sky. Water slapped gently against the docks. Gregor slowed the car and killed the headlights 2 blocks away from the warehouse. Felix leaned forward from the back seat. "That's the building," he said quietly. Robert studied it through the windshield. A wide blue warehouse, half the letters on its sign broken and hanging crooked. One dim light burned near a side door. Another flickered from a window near the roofline. Men who hid terrible things rarely bothered with good lighting. Gregor spoke. 2 guards outside. One walking the south wall. Robert nodded slowly. "Patrick inside?" Felix checked the phone he'd been tracking. "Most likely." Robert opened the car door. Cold harbor wind rushed in. "Let's move." They crossed the wet pavement without speaking. Felix disappeared first, sliding into the shadows along the fence line. Gregor moved toward the loading dock. Robert walked straight for the side entrance. The guard barely had time to look up before Gregor's hand pulled him into the darkness. A muffled struggle. Then silence. Robert reached the metal door and pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled like oil, rust, and damp wood. Old shipping crates stacked along the walls created narrow corridors between them. Voices drifted from the far end of the building. Robert raised a hand. They moved quietly through the maze of crates. 2 men sat at a table under a hanging light, arguing softly over a card game. A television muttered quietly nearby. They never saw Gregor approach. The moment was quick and silent. When it was over, the warehouse felt heavier, like the walls themselves understood something had shifted. Felix pointed down a hallway. "There." A locked metal door. Robert walked toward it slowly. On the other side of that door sat a woman who had spent days wondering if she would ever see her daughters again. Gregor stepped forward with the bolt cutter. One clean snap. The lock fell to the concrete floor. Robert opened the door. The room inside was small and cold. A single thin mattress sat against the wall. A plastic water bottle beside it. The woman sitting on the mattress flinched when the door opened. Her dark hair hung loose around a tired face. Bruises colored the skin near her wrists. Fear lived in her eyes. Robert crouched slightly so they were level. "My name is Robert Stoka," he said gently. She didn't answer. Her shoulders trembled. Robert continued quietly. "Your daughters are safe." Her breath caught. "Lily and Lola," he said softly. "They ran to me in a café." The woman stared at him, searching his face like someone afraid hope might be another trap. "They're warm," Robert added. "They've eaten. And they're waiting for you." The words broke something inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as both hands covered her mouth. Robert didn't rush her. After a moment he asked softly, "Can you walk?" She nodded through the tears. Gregor helped her stand. Just as they reached the hallway, voices erupted from the far side of the warehouse. More men. Felix moved forward instantly. The next minutes were fast and brutal, shadows moving between crates, footsteps echoing across concrete. Robert felt a knife slice across his forearm during the struggle, but he barely noticed. When the final noise faded, the warehouse fell silent again. Felix returned, breathing hard. Clear. Robert looked at the woman. We're leaving. They stepped outside into the cold harbor wind. The car engine started. And for the first time in days, the woman breathed like someone who believed tomorrow still existed. Hours later, the door to Dora's apartment opened quietly. Warm light filled the hallway. Two small figures sat at the kitchen table, refusing to sleep. Lily looked up first. Her chair scraped the floor as she jumped to her feet. Mom! The woman didn't even have time to answer before both daughters were in her arms. The sound she made was raw and broken and beautiful all at once. Three people holding each other like the world had nearly ended. Robert stood near the door, silent, watching. Lily eventually looked up over her mother's shoulder. Her eyes were red but bright. You did it, she whispered. Robert shrugged slightly. You helped. Lola stepped forward slowly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the creased photograph. The same one she had carried through fear and rain. She held it up. You kept it safe. Robert looked at the picture. Then at the woman standing alive in front of him. I didn't need it anymore, he said. The woman approached him carefully. Her voice shook. I don't know how to thank you. Robert shook his head. You don't need to. Lily tilted her head. But why did you do it? Robert thought for a moment. Then he said quietly, because sometimes the world puts the right people in front of you at the right moment, and the only real choice you have is to help. Silence settled softly in the room. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Morning light began to touch the edge of the sky. Robert stepped toward the door. Mr. Stoka, Lily said suddenly. He looked back. She smiled faintly. We'll be at the café Saturday. Lola nodded. The table near the heater. Robert almost smiled. I'll be in my booth. He stepped out into the quiet street. For years he believed that booth had been his refuge from the world. But now he understood something different. Sometimes the quiet places we protect aren't meant to hide us from life. Sometimes they're meant to bring the right people into it. Because in the end, wealth fades, power disappears, and pride means nothing. But kindness, the simple act of choosing to stand up for someone who cannot stand alone, that's the thing that stays. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey. And let me know in the comments which part of the world you're watching from.